everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Product Leaders, Here's How to Crush Your Next Board Meeting. My name is Rihanna, and I'm the Content Marketing Specialist here at Gainsight. I hope you're all as excited about this webinar as I am. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the slides and the recording before the end of the day. Let's meet our speakers. I'm super thrilled to have with us Ajay Agarwal and Nick Mehta. Ajay is an experienced software leader and board member and has been a partner at Bain Capital Ventures for over 16 years, where he focuses on early stage software investing. Ajay has served on over 27 boards and is currently a board member for companies including Optimizely, SendGrid, and of course, Gainsight. We're very fortunate to have Ajay on today because he sat on the other side of the table and will have a ton of valuable insights on what he and his fellow board members want to hear from product leaders. I'm also equally thrilled to introduce Nick Mehta. Nick is the CEO of Gainsight, and since he started here in 2013, he's raised over $156 million in funding and has grown Gainsight to span 7 offices with over 630 employees. Prior to Gainsight, Nick was the CEO of LiveOffice, held senior operating roles for public and private companies in the enterprise and consumer technology markets, and explored other successful ventures in the software space. Needless to say, he's done his fair share of board meetings and has a lot of advice to pass on today. So Nick, Ajay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rihanna. Really appreciate it. And big thanks to Ajay as well. So as Rihanna said, I'm Nick Mehta, CEO of Gainsight, and I'm really excited about this topic, and I'm going to spend a little time on Ajay's background as well when I ask him to introduce himself, because I think the two of us have sort of seen the two sides of the table for a long time in board meetings, and we've seen boards evolve a lot. So Ajay, it's really great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be part of this.
Awesome, and thank you for your part in the $156 million of funding. So we appreciate the partnership between Gainsight and Bain Capital Ventures. And I was going to ask you up front if you're open to sharing a little bit about your background, kind of coming from the operations side to then being on the investing side.
Absolutely. So I've had the fortune of being in the software industry now for almost 25 years. I started off my career at a startup in Austin, Texas called Trilogy Software. And, that business sold primarily to sales professionals, a software solution that managed the configuration, pricing, and quoting of complex solutions. And I had the benefit there of running product and go-to-market. And in many ways, my role was thinking about that intersection between what we built in the product and how that impacted our ability to sell and grow the business. And so I spent 8 years there. That business grew to about $300 million in revenue. And then from there, I joined Bain Capital Ventures a little over 16 years ago. And over the course of that time, I've worked with many amazing entrepreneurs and founders and CEOs, including Nick, and many others who are building modern cloud and SaaS companies over the course of this last decade. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been great to be able to leverage my operating experience and background in this role as being an investor and board member.
That's great, Ajay. And we were talking about this in preparing for this webinar. You've been a partner to Gainsight since 2013, so coming up on 6 years now, and we greatly appreciate it. And I think if we rewound the clock back to 2012, 2011, and you looked at a corporate board meeting, it would look pretty different than it does today. Just for people that weren't working back then, what would a board agenda look like back in 2011, 2012, and how has that changed over time?
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting to see the evolution in how founders and CEOs think about the board meeting, think about what's important. I mean, if you rewind the clock to my days selling software, pretty much the only thing that mattered was sales. Are you hitting the number? Are you gonna close the bookings target? And what opportunities and deals are remaining in the pipeline in order to get there. And I think the shift that really happened over the last 6 to 8 years, and a large part of this was driven by Gainsight and the evangelism, the community that Gainsight has built and grown, is this idea that with subscription businesses and recurring revenue businesses, that customer success and the overall 360-degree view of that customer has elevated in importance. And while in the 90s and the first part of the 2000s, the focus was exclusively on sales, now what we see in board meetings is an equal focus and attention on customer success. And companies leverage output and charts from their Salesforce systems to show the pipeline and the funnel and highlight exactly what the forecast is. Similarly, they're using screenshots and output from systems like Gainsight to highlight the customer success dashboards, the health of the customer base, any customers that might be at risk of not renewing, customers that might represent opportunities for upsell and expansion. And so it's really moved, customer success, I think, has moved from a world where it was a little bit ad hoc and anecdotal to now being incredibly quantified in terms of the health score, the forecasted gross retention, the forecasted net retention. These are things we never talked about 10 years ago, and now have become commonplace in the board meeting.
That's awesome. And I remember you and I did a webinar, thank you for doing it, back in 2013, actually, amazingly, 6 years ago, when we were in earlier parts of our life talking about customer success in the boardroom. And I think back then it was a new topic. CS leaders hadn't presented to board meetings before, or if they did, it was just about a big escalation. The metrics weren't clear. As you said, things have come a long way since then. And so that's what we want to talk about today is the next phase of that, in our opinion, is product getting a more formal seat in the boardroom. And, I'll talk a little bit about why that is, but also kind of maybe what's changing in that. So, I think the underlying changes are pretty obvious, kind of alludes a lot to what Ajay talked about in why customer success came into the boardroom. It's at the end of the day, all of these new business models with subscription, with cloud, with models where customers have a lot more power. It's changing the dynamic of what you need to monitor in your business. And sales is still super important, but now you have to think about your customers, and we'd argue now, think a lot more about your product. And customer success obviously is part of it. But at the end of the day, I think, Ajay, we're probably both seeing that a lot of the most modern companies realize, one of the most scalable ways to grow and to drive customer success is through the product. And so, that's something that I'm really excited to hear a little bit more from you on what you're seeing in that dimension. One of the things you and I talked about up front was how product has always maybe been part of a board meeting in terms of, here's the new release or here's the roadmap, but hasn't been as quantified as sales or customer success. It's hard to tell whether they're doing a good job or not from a metrics perspective. Tell me a little bit more about, when you think about product in the boardroom, what's it been like the past, 5-10 years, and what's the opportunity for that to go to the next level going forward?
Great question, Nick. It's funny in many ways, the way product is talked about in the boardrooms today, and certainly over the last 5 years, reminds me a lot of how customers were talked about 10 years ago. A lot of the same adjectives come to mind, anecdotal, ad hoc, every board meeting and company presents it a little bit differently, nothing, quantifiable, some highlights of the next release, longer term roadmap, some key product trade-offs and so forth. But as you mentioned, nothing really measurable or quantifiable. And I think what we're seeing and is a similar inflection point that we saw with customer success 6-7 years ago, where there's now an inflection point around product and how product is discussed in the boardroom. And I think it's driven by the fact that, increasingly a higher and higher percentage of how a company interacts with their customers is by their product. It's by their application.